Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. It's about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album from Metric, titled Pagans in Vegas. So here's something I bet the majority of you do not know. Back during the summer of 2012, when I was first getting a handle on making some of these reviews in written form on my blog, I reviewed Synthetica by Canadian indie rock band Metric, a group that I tend to like and admire but never quite love. The sort of overly ambitious indie rock act that like to play with some nifty big ideas and anthemic choruses that never quite managed to stick the landing on for a full album, at least for me. Like most people, I started getting into them with their noisier, razor-tight 2009 album Fantasies, a record that anchored its groove in some buzzing guitars and synthesizers, some punchy drums, and the eerie multi-tracking of Emily Haynes' vocals. And yet, that album always falls a little bit short for me. Maybe it was the disparity between a great Metric song and a bland one was very palpable. Maybe it was Emily Haynes' vocal timbre feeling perpetually disconnected from the song she was singing about, or maybe it was the lyrics that didn't hit home as often as they really should. But Fantasies was about half of a great record. Still good, but kind of feeling disappointed that it could have been a lot better. And upon reflection, I probably make a similar observation about Synthetica as well. Overall, a more ambitious, cohesive, and engaging album, but never quite hitting the huge high points from Fantasies to songs like Gold Guns Girls or Give Me Sympathy. And it seemed as though the rough edges and the grooves were slowly being smoothed away in favor of more mechanical synthesizers. Of course, it fit the running motif of the album, distinguishing the difference between the human and the artificial and the increased difficulty of that. But with a rare exception, it felt like only about half that album really stuck with me long term. Although here I suspect I'm in the minority, as Metric only seemed to be getting bigger on Canadian alternative radio with an ever-increasing profile as an indie rock act with some real crossover potential, potentially even internationally. And yet, in hindsight, Metric steps toward new wave and synthpop almost seem prophetic nowadays, because over the past 2 to 3 years, a considerable number of their peers have gone in the exact same direction, which might not be the best thing for Metric, especially given they got close competition from Churches, whose sophomore album is breathing right around their neck, right around the corner. It's coming out in a couple of weeks, and it was even further concerning to hear that more of this album was supposedly more synth-driven, with Metric having an entire analog album waiting in the wings for apparently next year. So okay, what did we get with Pagans in Vegas? Well, here's the thing. On some level, it's a Metric album, for better or for worse, and as such it features the usual strengths and weaknesses. At its best, it features some surprisingly emotive vocals from Emily Haynes balanced against some killer melodic new wave grooves that fuse in some sticky synthesizer melodies with roiling guitars and incredibly precise drum work. Oh, a deft lyricism with nuggets of real power hidden behind deceptively simple lines. And like all Metric albums, it only lands that impact for about half the record, leaving a good album that ends up feeling disappointing because it could have been a great one. In this case though, Metric's thematic progression takes them into some trickier territory, and I'm not quite sure the intended satire hits quite as well as it should. In other words, it was more ambitious in its themes, and as such kind of disappoints when it doesn't quite execute them. Now I should explain, for once we're going to start with lyrics and themes. As with Synthetica, there's a running duality between Metric's indie rock authenticity and the synth-driven artificiality. But this time Metric steps straight into the synthpop side of the latter, embracing some shallow, borderline mechanical, plastic pop nature of the music against their better nature in order to subvert it. In short, it's a very similar arc that Icon for Hire took with their self-titled album in 2013, or 21 Pilots took with Blurry Face this year. And like both those albums, there's the commentary on the genre and the conversation with the audience running alongside. I like how songs like Fortune showed them trying to wring real emotion out of pop music, managing to slip into the scene and keep that exuberance. One of the reasons that Celebrate can feel so desperate. I appreciate Cascades implying that once you start building momentum in that pop world, you can start to forget the formula that gave you success in the first place and just fall into aimless repetition. I appreciate despite the ideal she put forward on tracks like Lie Lie Lie, she does succumb to some of the shallow, capricious nature of pop divas on For Kicks. And I really like the spiral out of control that came on Too Bad, So Sad, with a just as capricious audience. And as the arc proceeds to Metric trying to win back some of those old fans or find that middle path in between, they're smart enough to question the authenticity of the emotions on both sides. How success can prove alienating and kind of lonely, while reckless blind love can leave you broke in the end. You can't make money off it. And the album's conclusion, where they face the very real flaws of their old world with fresh eyes and yet yearn for it, it's never going to be the same going back to it. And the two-part instrumental, The Face, carries that melancholy exceedingly well. And of course, there are plenty of details that pepper songs like Lie 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 and The Governess, especially in the form with how Metric sells out to get to the top, and yet the wider audience assumes that Emily Haynes just slept with the director instead of through any artistic merit of their own. Now there is that underlying distance and borderline contempt for the pop audience that creeps through on some of these songs, and while it's nowhere near as pronounced or as toxic as it was on Fall Out Boy's Save Rock and Roll, and there is some element of truth in some of their nuance, especially when it focuses more on the indie fan base, it can kind of sour some of the vibe of these songs, but you know what? You've got the foundation for a really good satire of pop music culture, and a lot of the insight is there in the lyrics. But for all that nuance to land well, there needs to be some sign that Metric can make that sort of brand of synthpop work for them and show that intoxicating slide into that world, or at least be able to subvert the more pop-flavored material in a way that doesn't really tarnish the vibe. And that's the first big stumbling point on this album. Well, it's because while Metric can imitate and mimic mainstream accessible synthpop, they aren't very good at making it quality. See, that was the hidden trick behind, say, Kesha's half-parody material, or the pop rock that Fall Out Boy and 21 Pilots made. They can still be enjoyed as solid pop rock songs without going beyond into the deeper meaning. But tracks like The Shade and Celebrate, and especially Blind Valentine, they might recall some elements of the genre, but they don't really hit the high notes. They're not great songs. And sure, you could argue that some of the blandness is part of that point, but Haynes' commentary on The Shade going in suggests that she was going for the straightforward summer song. And as a straightforward summer song, it's just not very good. And before we go deeper into that element, let's talk about a surprising development here. Emily Haynes herself. I've never been wowed by her vocal range, but there is a certain amount of expressiveness that does land success here, and she's able to play the Britney Spears-esque pop starlet alarmingly well. And yet at the same time, she can hop back to her lower register and deliver some more soulful, rough-edged material that's more in line with her indie roots and does sound really good. And I honestly don't even mind the heavy autotune that was piled on Cascades. Thematically, it fits, and as I said, Emily Haynes can pull off the Vocaloid impression pretty well. That said, the inclusion of the male vocals on the other side did really fall flat for me. I get why they were included to show that other side, potentially representing the forgotten fans on the indie side, or even playing the track more intimately to describe that fallen apart relationship, but they weren't nearly as compelling. They probably could have been skipped. But we beat around the biggest issues for a while, so let's talk about the instrumentation and the production. And here's the thing. Like most Metric albums, there are great songs here, and I can pinpoint exactly why. The grooves. On the surface, I'm not exactly against the heavier addition of keyboards and synthesizers and effects, the chintzy eeriness flowing into the gorgeous Arion-esque sound on Fortunes, the rubbery synth bounce against those oily grooves on Too Bad So Sad, with the great guitars on the hook, the bluesy snarl that drives Lie Lie Lie, the acoustic groove balanced against the more springy effects before picking up some more swell on Governess, and the two-part instrumental that ends out the album, almost all on keyboards. That was really solid. But the majority of these songs are rooted in that more propulsive, lower guitars in order to drive the momentum. And without them, many of the synthesizers just feel oddly runny and smeared over against the razor-thin percussion. They don't have that groove, and many of them have too many chiptune sputters and swirls to balance well. Many of these songs just feel over-mixed. Worst of all, the choppy acoustic strums that build to the lumbering synth line on Blind Valentine, it just does not sound pleasant. That before we get songs like Cascades and For Kicks, it might as well stand as love letters to Depeche Mode and The Cure, which would be fine if the tone was consistent on those songs. Don't get me wrong, I love Depeche Mode and The Cure, but the tonal whiplash that comes on the upbeat chorus of For Kicks added a considerable crack to that post-punk vibe and immersion. And as I said, when Metric goes for pure pop, I can appreciate the genre imitation, but they could have more life and color to these synth tones that have more momentum. They're just not that great of pop songs. But as a whole, I really want to like this album a lot more than I do. Conceptually and lyrically, there's a ton to like, and I always appreciate the meta commentary that comes with albums like these. It's right up my alley. But instrumentally, it's not as tight or as nuanced in the choice of grooves or synth tones to back up those lyrics. For me, it's a very light 7 out of 10 and a recommendation for fans of Metric. But look, we're in a year with a lot of synth pop, with some of the best with the Wombats and Lower Dens, and hell, 21 Pilots. This is good, but I can see this album getting overshadowed as early as next week, so I might enjoy it, but good luck remembering it. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or any other albums coming out that you want me to take a look at, I'd be more than happy to give them a listen. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.